On a Tuesday in October, a man arrived at the Manhattan Vought Tower with his teenage son and left without him. This document is a record of what that son became. The lobby of Vought Tower had a ceiling that belonged in a cathedral, not because it was beautiful, though it was, in the specific way that things built to make people feel small are beautiful, but because the scale of it was deliberate. Every inch of the atrium's 90-foot rise was an architectural argument. You are here because we permitted you to be here, and the space above your head is the distance between you and the people who make decisions. The ambient music was curated, something orchestral, warm. Designed by a firm that specialized in the psychology of retail environments and had applied those same principles to a building that sold superhuman beings as a publicly traded asset. The jvac hummed beneath it at a frequency you felt before you heard. The marble floors reflected the overhead lighting in a way that made every visitor's footsteps echo slightly, as though the building were gently reminding you that it could hear you coming. Mark Grayson looked up at the ceiling and kept looking at it for 3 full seconds, which was longer than his father had looked at anything since they'd arrived. "Come on," Nolan said, not unkindly, just efficiently. Edgar's people met them at the executive entrance, not the public one, which had a security queue and a gift shop visible through the glass. The executive entrance opened on the building's north side and required a badge that one of the 2 Vought assistants produced from a jacket pocket with the practiced smoothness of someone who had done this particular type of errand several hundred times. They were led through a corridor that had no signage, past a bank of elevators that required a separate access credential to call, and into a car that went to floors not listed on the standard directory. Mark was wearing jeans and a gray pullover. He was carrying a backpack, school issue, slightly scuffed at the bottom corner, with a keychain on the zipper pull that he'd had since 9th grade. In the mirrored elevator wall, he could see himself and his father standing side by side, and the contrast was the kind of thing that would have been funny under different circumstances. Nolan looked like he belonged in every building he had ever entered. Mark looked like he had gotten on the wrong bus. "This is still the plan?" Mark said, low enough that only his father could hear it. The assistants were looking at their tablets. "Yes," Nolan said, "because the last 3 months I thought maybe there was a different. The plan hasn't changed." Mark looked at the floor indicator. 67. 68. "I just want to make sure I understand it, that's all. I go in there and I work for these people and I don't. You do what they ask," Nolan said. "Still quiet, still efficient. You don't reveal your ceiling. Do you understand me? They can never know your ceiling." Mark looked at his father's reflection. "What's my ceiling?" Nolan was quiet for exactly 1 floor. "You don't have one," he said. The elevator reached 97. Stan Edgar's office was the kind of room that made you understand how people thought about power before they had to start apologizing for thinking about it that way. No photos, no awards. 2 chairs across from his desk, not 3, not 4, as though Edgar had long ago decided the maximum useful number of people in any conversation was himself and 1 other, and had arranged the furniture to reflect this conviction permanently. Edgar was at his desk when they entered. He did not stand. He watched Nolan cross the room and take the chair on the right, and he watched Mark take the chair on the left, and his gaze moved between them with the quality of a man conducting an inventory. Not rude. Professional, the specific attention of someone for whom every meeting had a purpose, and whose face never revealed which part of the purpose he was currently evaluating. The contract signing took 23 minutes. Edgar read sections. Nolan initialed. Mark watched. He watched Edgar more than he watched the papers. Edgar's hands moved with precise economy. Turn the page, indicate the line, wait. His pen did not hover. Every signature point had been pre-marked with a small adhesive tab, which meant someone in his organization had prepared this contract assuming Nolan would sign it, which meant the negotiation, whatever form it had taken, was already finished before this meeting began. The room smelled like fresh paper and something under it, a very faint, very expensive cologne that Mark's nose cataloged automatically and filed away the way it filed away everything. Near the end, Edgar looked at Mark directly, not at Nolan. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. "Mr. Grayson," Edgar said, "you'll begin assessment protocols this afternoon. We have high expectations." Then he returned to the papers. Nolan shook Edgar's hand. Mark watched the handshake. Edgar's grip was controlled and brief. A handshake is punctuation rather than communication. Then they were moving toward the door, and the meeting was over, and the deal was done in the way that all genuinely important deals were done. Not with drama, but with paperwork in a quiet room. In the elevator going down, Nolan straightened his cufflink. He did not look at Mark. "That's it?" Mark said. "That's it." He didn't ask me anything. He had everything he needed from the physical data we pre-submitted. Mark thought about this. The elevator descended. "Do what they ask," he said, repeating it back, not sarcastically, genuinely working through it. "Don't show them everything." "Correct. And then what?" Nolan was quiet for a moment in the specific way that meant the answer existed but was not going to be given. "Do your job," he said. "I'll be in contact." The assessment facility was on sublevel 7, which the building's official schematics listed as a mechanical infrastructure level. The corridor leading to it had fluorescent lighting and the smell of ozone and hydraulic fluid. The working smell. The smell of a level that wasn't meant to be impressive. The researchers waiting inside were 4 of them, in the white coats that served as Vaught's scientific uniform, with tablets and clipboards and a specific variety of professional calm that Mark would come to recognize as the expression worn by people who have seen unusual things so often that unusual things no longer registered as unusual. The lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Chen. She introduced herself, shook Mark's hand. He calibrated his grip precisely, which he had been doing for 4 years, which had started to feel less like effort and more like breathing, and explained the protocol with the thoroughness of someone reciting a document she had memorized but still respected. The lift test was first. A weighted platform, calibrated hydraulic resistance, the scale designed to measure output up to the highest threshold the equipment was built to reach. Homelander's standard, the reference ceiling for everything the facility had been constructed to assess. The instruction was straightforward. Push against the resistance until he couldn't. Mark put his hands on the platform. He pushed, gently, the way you'd push a door to test whether it was locked. The resistance spiked. The machine's readout climbed. He pushed more, and the readout climbed further, and then it hit the maximum display and stayed there, pinned at the top of the scale, and Mark had not broken a sweat. He could feel the structural steel of the apparatus beginning to complain, not the measuring mechanism, the housing, the specific vibration of metal that had been asked to do more than its engineers had accounted for. He stopped pushing. From across the room, one of the junior researchers said, very quietly, he was still pushing when I stopped the clock. "Doctor," Chen made a note. Her voice was level. "Move to ballistics." The autocannon was military grade, mounted on a reinforced frame, the kind of hardware that existed in a sub-level testing facility, because Vaught's relationship with the Department of Defense was old enough and deep enough that military-grade equipment moved between the two organizations with the paperwork efficiency of an inter-office memo. Mark stood against the bulkhead. The muzzle was close, within the range that the protocol described as contact adjacent, which was a clinical way of saying close enough that the rounds were supposed to do everything they were designed to do. The burst was brief. 3 rounds, controlled spacing. They didn't penetrate. They flattened, the specific deformation of a projectile that has met something denser than its design anticipated, and redistributed its kinetic energy outward instead of forward. The rounds dropped to the floor. They were warm. Mark's shirt had 3 small puckers in the fabric where they'd impacted. He looked down at the puckers. He looked back up. Dr. Chen's voice recorder picked up a pause in her audio notes, a gap of about 2 seconds where she stopped dictating. Then she continued, her voice identical to before. The wind tunnel was last. They brought it to maximum output, the highest aerodynamic stress load the facility's equipment could generate, a specification that had never been exceeded in its operational history. The air hit Mark's chest like a wall trying to introduce itself. He leaned into it. He leaned into it the way you lean into a cold morning, present, adjusted, comfortable. And then, out of curiosity rather than intention, he leaned a little further. The tunnel's structural housing began to warp. The sound of it was low and resonant, steel making the specific complaint of metal being asked to contain something it hadn't been designed to contain, a long, groaning note that climbed slightly in pitch before the technician hit the emergency shutoff. The tunnel wound down. Silence, except for the ticking of cooling equipment. Mark straightened up. He looked at the housing, the slight inward deformation along the intake frame, and felt, briefly and genuinely, a flash of embarrassment. The way you feel when you've accidentally broken something by forgetting how strong you are. He almost apologized. Then he remembered where he was and what this place was, and who was going to be watching the footage of this room tonight. He said nothing. Dr. Chen made her final notes. Her handwriting, looking at the page afterward, was less steady than the recordings preceding today. Not dramatically, someone who wasn't looking for it wouldn't notice. Someone who was looking for it noticed immediately. Homelander had been watching every second. He had watched the lift test from the observation room above, rewound twice on the footage. He had the ballistics test paused on a secondary screen, the frame where the rounds were in the air just before impact. He had watched the wind tunnel on live feed and had not moved for the last 2 minutes of it. His assistant entered with a tablet, started to speak about a media appearance rescheduled for tomorrow morning. Homelander was quiet for a moment. His eyes were on the screen, on the footage of a 17-year-old in a gray pullover standing in a wind tunnel that had bent itself trying to push him backward. "Bring him up to my floor," Homelander said. "No assistants, no cameras, just him." His assistant paused. This was not protocol. Homelander did not turn around. "Now, please," he said. His voice was warm, professionally warm, in the specific texture of his public persona. But his eyes, reflected in the dark screen beside the footage, were doing something different from warm. They were calculating. Nolan Grayson's aircraft exited Earth's atmosphere at 6:47 p.m. Eastern. He did not look back at the planet. He had an appointment on the other side of the star system, and a perfectly laid plan. The plan, at this exact moment, was already failing, though neither he nor anyone who matters knows it yet. The Seven's briefing room was on the 44th floor, which put it below the executive suites and above the media production levels. The building's physical way of communicating exactly where the team sat in the organizational hierarchy. The room itself was designed for a specific kind of meeting, the kind where information moved in one direction. A long table, 7 chairs, a presentation screen occupying the full width of one wall. No windows. The lighting was the warm, flattering kind that filmed well on the assumption that someone was always filming. Homelander introduced Mark in 3 sentences. Name, physical profile described as unique, without elaboration. Directive that the team should treat him as a full member, effective immediately, with all access and operational inclusion that entailed. Then he sat down, which meant the introduction was over, and the room processed it. Queen Maeve looked at Mark from across the table. The look lasted about 4 seconds longer than a polite acknowledgement required. It was not hostile. It was the specific attention of someone conducting an assessment they needed to complete before they could decide anything else. She looked at him the way a person looks at a room they've just been told they have to move into, cataloging, measuring, noting the exits. Annie January Starlight, in the press materials, sat 2 chairs from Maeve and watched Mark with an expression that was more open than anyone else at the table. She was the newest member before today, and newness had not yet finished costing her the things it was going to cost her. The particular quality of hope she carried had not yet been systematically addressed by the institution. She looked at Mark with the attentiveness of someone who recognized, in another person's newness, the echo of their own. Her recognition was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. The Deep said, "Man, it is so great to have you here. Seriously, any questions about the team dynamic, the workflow, how we coordinate on media days? I am literally your guy for all of that." Mark said it was good to meet him. A train did not look up from his phone. Black Noir was still in the way that objects are still, not suppressing movement, simply without any particular relationship to it. After the meeting, Mark found Maeve in the corridor. He introduced himself properly, which he was aware was slightly awkward given that the introduction had technically just happened. But the briefing room version hadn't felt like an actual conversation. Maeve looked at him with the same assessing quality as before. Then she said, "Watch what you agree to. In this building, every yes is permanent." He thanked her. He said he'd keep that in mind. "You won't," she said, not meanly, as a prediction, with the flat accuracy of someone who had made it before about other people and been right. "But you'll remember I said it." She walked away. In the corridor behind her, Annie was still standing near the briefing room door. She had heard the exchange. She looked at Mark for a moment with an expression that processed Maeve's words in real time, measuring their weight against her own experience of 3 months inside this building. "She's not wrong," Annie said. And then, quieter, "She's never wrong." Mark stood in the corridor and thought about what both of them meant. He was still thinking about it 4 days later, which was the day of the bank robbery, and he had not arrived at anything he found fully satisfying. The Midtown response came through at 11:15 on a Wednesday. 9 robbers, coordinated, military-grade equipment that Vaught's analysts flagged as former Dodie stock that had moved through 2 private sales. 31 hostages. A standoff running for 2 hours and 20 minutes, long enough for the news trucks to have positioned themselves, and for Vaught's PR team to have coordinated the feed access. Mark flew alongside Homelander to the site. The briefing in transit was professional. Entry points, hostage positions, the distribution of the 9 robbers across the interior. Mark had questions about the negotiation status, and Homelander told him there wasn't one, which meant the current plan was intervention rather than resolution, which meant the intervention should be fast enough that resolution happened as a consequence. Mark said he'd go through the side. He outlined the approach. Disarm the perimeter positions first, then move to the interior, where the remaining 7 were distributed between the hostages. He had done versions of this before, smaller scale, in the months before Vought. The math was clean. Homelander said nothing. His expression said the math was fine. Mark went through the side. The wall took his entry without complaint. A controlled breach. The specific force of someone who had calibrated exactly how much of a hole they needed and made exactly that hole. The first robber was turning when Mark's hand closed on the barrel of his rifle and removed it from the situation. The robber sat down very quickly, which was the body's response to a man who had just taken a rifle away from him, the way you'd take a pencil from a child. The second robber managed to get a shot off, into the floor, because his arms were already being redirected downward, before he was also sitting down, dazed, unhurt, looking at his empty hands. The hostages nearest to Mark's entry point were already looking at him. Some of them were reaching toward him. One woman had her hand out, not a grab, a reach. The specific gesture of someone who needed to confirm that what they were seeing was real. Mark was moving toward the interior positions, tracking the remaining 7 by sound, breathing, weight distribution. The specific audio of 7 people trying to be quiet while holding weapons when the front wall came apart. Homelander didn't use an entrance. He made one. The heat vision was controlled in the way that a surgeon's cut is controlled. Not imprecise, but also not gentle, because precision and gentleness are not the same thing, and in this context only one of them mattered to the person using it. 3 robbers died before the debris from the front wall finished settling. A 4th caught the edge of it, not directly, but the edge was enough. And the result was a wound that the man was going to spend the next 3 months recovering from, if he recovered at all. Hostages screamed. Several of them were on the floor. The ones near the front of the room were covered in wall dust and moving in the disoriented way of people whose nervous systems had just received more input than they could process sequentially. Homelander was already turning toward the cameras. The Vought PR team had positioned 3 feeds with clean angles on the entry point. His face, by the time the cameras found it, was arranged into the expression of heroic necessity, the grim satisfaction of a man who has done a hard thing because it was the right thing. He had been making that face for 15 years. It was very good. Mark was looking at the 4th robber, at the wound, at the specific quality of damage that was going to require decisions in the next 90 seconds that the emergency services outside were not yet positioned to make. He started toward the man. Homelander's hand closed on his arm. Not a grab, a direction. The grip was iron, but the motion was measured. The kind of physical redirection that someone watching on camera would read as collegial, a senior hero orienting a newer one. His voice was low and warm, the public voice scaled down for an audience of 1. "Smile," Homelander said. "You're on television." Mark's jaw was tight. He could feel the specific pressure of Homelander's grip. Significant, the full force of the strongest compound V expression in existence, and it registered the way all physical sensation registered for him lately, as information rather than threat. He looked at the camera. He arranged his face. He smiled. The hostage was handled by medics. He survived, technically, which was the phrase the incident report would use and which the narrator notes with the specific flatness of language that is run out of adjacent words. The stairwell on the building's east side was out of camera range. Homelander had known this when he suggested they take it. Mark understood this only after they were in it, and the door had closed, and the ambient sound of the post-incident scene outside became a muffled background texture rather than a present reality. The warmth was gone. It left his voice the way a broadcast loses its signal, not gradually, but between one moment and the next, present and then not. What replaced it was not cruelty exactly. It was the specific register of someone who has calculated that performance is no longer the most efficient mode for this conversation. "The disarming," Homelander said. "The 2 on your entry side." "That was fine, technically. They're alive," Mark said. "Yes," Saeed as a neutral observation rather than an endorsement. "The issue is the narrative. 2 disarmed robbers sitting on the floor is not a frame. Dead robbers and a rescued crowd is a frame. You created a messy middle. I created the condition for a surrender. You created footage that requires explanation." Homelander looked at him. "The explanation costs time. Airtime. Airtime is not free." Mark looked at the stairwell wall. Gray painted cinder block, the specific institutional color of spaces that exist for function rather than experience. "Those were people," he said, quietly, not as an argument, as a statement of a fact he needed to say out loud. Homelander's hand came to the back of his neck. Not a collar grab, a grip, the specific placement of a hand that communicated hierarchy through pressure rather than words. The weight of it was considerable. Mark went still. "Look at what you did in there," Homelander said. "You took 2 armed men's rifles away from them before they understood you were in the room. Does that sound like something a person does?" Mark said nothing. "We are not people. Homelander's voice was the same temperature as the cinder block, and the sooner you accept that, the less it's going to cost you every time. He held the position for another 2 seconds. Mark could make him stop. He knew this. He could remove the hand and put Homelander through the wall at the end of the stairwell in one motion, and neither of them would have been wrong about the other's read of the physics. He did not move. The hand released. "Good," Homelander said. The warmth was back in his voice. "Reinstalled, the way you reinstall something that was never load-bearing. You'll learn." He went through the stairwell door. The warmth went with him. Mark stood in the gray corridor for a moment. He was not shaking. He had never shaken, not once in 4 years of manifested powers. Because the things that made humans shake did not register in him the same way. He was thinking, running the conversation back, finding the specific sentence, "We are not people," and examining it the way you examine something that is stuck in a wound, deciding whether to pull it out or leave it. He left it. That night, in the apartment Vought had given him on the 32nd floor. He sat awake on the edge of the bed and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling window. The city at night was the specific proof that enormous numbers of people existed, and continued to exist, and would continue to exist tomorrow, regardless of what happened on the 44th floor or in a midtown stairwell. The light of it was constant and indifferent, and he found, to his slight surprise, that he did not find this comforting in the way he would have expected to find it comforting 6 months ago. He sat with the fact of the fourth robber and the specific quality of survival that the incident report called technical. He sat with Homelander's hand on his neck and the choice he had made not to remove it. He was waiting for the guilt to arrive. He had expected it. He had felt guilt before. Small things, normal things, the ordinary moral friction of a person who makes mistakes and knows it. He waited. It was a long night. Trans-Pacific Air Flight 37, a Boeing 787, departed Los Angeles International at 9:05 am carrying 319 passengers and crew. At 10:47 am, 4 individuals with military-grade equipment seized control of the cockpit and destroyed the flight controls. At 10:52 am, Vought Emergency Dispatch received the Priority 1 alert. At 10:53 am, Homelander and Mark Grayson were airborne. The Pacific at 37,000 feet looked like a texture rather than a body of water. Gray-blue, slightly matte in the overcast light, extending in every direction to where the horizon curved away into haze. The aircraft was visible from 40 miles out, a silver shape trailing a thin contrail, moving at the specific speed of something that no longer had a pilot making active decisions about its trajectory. Mark flew alongside the fuselage and ran the numbers in the time it took to cover the last mile. The 787's glide ratio, unpowered from 37,000 feet with no control surfaces, gave approximately 90 miles of forward distance before the descent curve became unsurvivable. They were over open ocean. There were no airports within 90 miles that a 787 with no controls could reach, even theoretically. Standard rescue protocol assumed a recovery window of 20 minutes. The structural analysis on holding a 787 from below, distributed load across the fuselage, sustained flight at -G differential to create net lift, was something he had worked out in his head 3 times in the past 90 seconds, and arrived at the same answer each time. He could do it. The math was clean. It required him to get below the aircraft, brace against the underside at the center of mass, and generate sustained lift at a level that was within his current capability. Not comfortable, not without cost, but within it. Passengers would need to brace for an unconventional descent. The rate of descent he could manage would be survivable if the cabin crew prepared correctly. He was already calculating the positioning approach when Homelander drew level with him. "The aircraft is unrecoverable," Homelander said. His voice carried the specific flatness of a briefing. "This is the operational reality. Here are the parameters. Controls are physically destroyed. No mechanical solution. I can hold it, Mark said. Homelander looked at him, not at the aircraft. I've done the math, Mark continued. Center of mass, sustained lift at the fuselage midpoint, controlled descent rate. The passengers need to brace, but it's survivable. I can bring it down. Homelander was quiet for 2 seconds. His face was doing something complicated behind its operational stillness. You can hold the plane, he said. Yes, you can hold the plane, he said again. Different emphasis, not agreement, excavation. He was finding something inside the statement. And every camera in the world is below us right now. News helicopters. Satellite feeds. Vought PR had 4 networks on standby before we left the tower. He looked at the aircraft. Then back at Mark. You carry 319 people to a safe landing. You're the hero. Every camera in the world has you. The new one. The unknown. And from this moment forward, the only question anyone asks is, who is he? Where did he come from? And why is he stronger than Homelander? The ocean moved beneath them, slow and enormous. Is that what your father wanted? Homelander said. The sentence landed the way it was designed to land, not as a question but as a key, inserted into a specific lock that Homelander had spent 3 months identifying. Mark's father. The mission. They can never know your ceiling. Mark processed it in the time it took to cover 200 meters. He turned toward the aircraft. He was going to do it. He had made the decision. He could feel the decision the way you feel your weight shift when you've committed to a step. The passengers were in there, 319 of them. He was doing this. Homelander's forearm came across his collarbone like a wall. Not a punch. A hold. Homelander drove him backward through open air and into the aircraft fuselage. Controlled. Directional. The force calibrated to move Mark rather than to damage the aircraft. They went through the fuselage skin and into the cabin, and the world became very loud. The passengers. They were everywhere. In seats, in aisles, the ones who had been trying to brace against the turbulence of an aircraft with no pilot. Dozens of faces turning toward the breach in the fuselage wall, toward the 2 figures who had come through it, toward the specific impossibility of what was happening with expressions that were trying to process relief and terror simultaneously, and landing somewhere between them that had no name. Someone grabbed Mark's arm. Multiple someones, hands on his sleeve, on his shoulder. The physical reaching of people who needed confirmation that what they were seeing was real. A woman in the aisle was saying something that Mark's mind split apart into components. A name, not hers, someone else's, a child's name repeated twice. A man near the rear was speaking into his phone with the focused calm of someone who understood that this call might be the last thing he did, and had decided it would be useful rather than not. Homelander's forearm was against Mark's collarbone, his body weight backing it, driving him backward through 2 rows of seats until Mark's spine connected with the bulkhead at the rear of the business class section. The structure held. Homelander was calibrating, as always, the force that moved without destroying, the force that communicated dominance without generating inconvenient evidence. 3 inches between their faces. The passengers were screaming. Some of them. Others had gone quiet in the specific way of people whose nervous systems had prioritized observation over reaction. The descent curve was steepening. Mark could feel it in his inner ear, in the change of angle of every surface around him. I know you can make me stop, Homelander said. Below the cabin noise, below the wind through the breach in the fuselage wall, a voice meant for Mark and no one else. I know you could put me through this hull right now. You're stronger than me, aren't you? You knew it, I think, the day we shook hands. Mark's hands were at his sides, not raised, not pushing back. He was braced against the bulkhead with Homelander's forearm across his chest, and his body capable of ending this in a single motion, and his hands at his sides. But you won't, Homelander said. Because you're still trying to be good. And that is the only chain that will ever hold you. The aircraft shuddered. A new sound entered the cabin, a low, structural groan from somewhere in the airframe that was the aircraft's way of communicating that the descent curve had reached a threshold. "Let them go," Homelander said, "and let yourself be what you are." 15 seconds. Mark ran the number without choosing to run it. His mind produced it automatically. 15 seconds remained in the window where the lift solution was executable. Then 12, then 10. He stopped straining against the forearm. He had not been straining hard, not at his capacity, not close to it. But he had been straining. And then he wasn't. The choice was not dramatic. It did not feel like a door closing. It felt like a calculation completing. His father's directive. The mission. The ceiling that couldn't be shown. He had stacked these facts against 319 people, and the facts had won. And the winning felt like nothing at all. Which was the most frightening part. Homelander released him. Stepped back. They exited through the breach in the fuselage separately. The cold at this altitude hit without ceremony. The Pacific air at 37,000 feet was the temperature of a place that did not account for the preferences of anything inside it. Mark ascended 50 meters above the aircraft and stopped there and looked down at it. He watched it. He did not look away. He had some sense that looking away would be a second choice. A choice to be protected from the first one, and he was not going to be protected from it. The aircraft's descent curve was visible, the specific angle of a thing that is committed to its trajectory. The ocean below was still the gray-blue texture, still matte in the overcast light, and then the aircraft reached it. The sound carried even at this altitude. Brief. Low register. A bass impact followed by a resonance that lasted about 2 seconds and then resolved into nothing. Then the ocean was the ocean again. Mark looked at Homelander, who had watched the impact from 20 meters to his left, with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into the expression of a man who has made a hard decision and has the discipline not to flinch from the consequences of it. "I want to go back to the tower," Mark said. His own voice surprised him slightly, not its content, but its texture. The qualifiers were gone. The slight hesitation that had been present in his voice since childhood, the sound of someone whose mind moved faster than was comfortable, and who had learned to slow the external version to match the expected pace, that was not in his voice. What was there instead was declarative, flat and complete. Homelander looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, or the brother of recognition. He said nothing. He turned toward the coast and flew. Mark followed. Below them, the ocean was doing what oceans do, continuing, enormous, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just been added to it. 3 days after Flight 37, the official Vought statement attributed the crash to catastrophic structural failure. The investigation yielded no evidence of soup involvement. The narrative was clean. Homelander gave a press conference in which his voice broke twice, genuine seeming, technically accomplished, the performance of a man who had done this long enough that the technical and the genuine had ceased to have a meaningful boundary between them. Mark stood beside him in the frame. He looked into the cameras with the composed expression of someone who has nothing to hide, because hiding implies a relationship to the thing being concealed, and Mark had made his peace with what happened over 37,000 feet of Pacific Ocean in the time it took to fly back to the tower. Not because he had decided it was right, because his nervous system had processed the choice and come back without the response he had been waiting for. The guilt had not arrived. He was beginning to understand that it was not coming. In the corridor afterward, Annie was waiting for him. Not to confront him, she was too careful for that, and 3 months inside Vought Tower had already begun teaching her the cost of confrontations in the wrong spaces. She looked at him with an expression he did not have a clean word for. Something between grief and the recognition that she was standing next to a version of what she might become if the institution had its way for long enough. She didn't say anything. Neither did Mark. He walked past her and she let him go, and the space between them in that corridor was the specific measurement of the distance this building put between people who might otherwise have been in the same moral territory. Billy Butcher had a system. The system was not complicated, because complicated systems failed in complicated ways, and Butcher had spent enough years operating in environments where failure had immediate and personal consequences to develop a preference for things that broke cleanly when they broke. The system was, find the thing that matters to the target, find the person who controls that thing, and present the target with a choice. Soups responded to this because Soups, underneath the abilities, were still operating from human psychological architecture. They had egos, images, things they needed, love, control, the specific chemical reward of public approval. These were pressure points. Butcher's entire career was the application of pressure to pressure points. He had been running background on Mark Grayson since the Vought announcement, 6 months ago now, and the background was wrong in a way that bothered him the way a table with one short leg bothered him. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong in a way that was constantly present. The civilian history checked out, but the physical assessment data his source inside Vaught's medical division had pulled told a story that the Compound V literature did not contain. He had read the entire Compound V literature. The numbers from Mark Grayson's assessment were not in it. Not close to it, not theoretically adjacent to it. He had let it bother him for 6 months while he ran the Flight 37 timeline. Hughie had pushed hard on the forensic chain. Mother's Milk had run the aviation contacts. Frenchie had handled the Vought internal comms. Kimiko had sat across the table while they assembled it and looked at the assembled picture with the expression of someone who had seen atrocity before and recognized its family resemblances. By the time the data was clean enough to act on, Butcher had made a decision about the kid that he recognized, in retrospect, as optimistic. He had decided the kid might not know what Homelander really was. He had decided the kid was young and possibly reachable, and that the correct move was a soft approach, information gathering, see what was actually in there before committing to a direction. This decision was going to cost him an evening and the last of his patience for optimism. He told the others this was soft, information gathering. He told Frenchie to keep the van 2 blocks east. He went alone, which was not standard operating procedure, and which he did because he understood, at the level of the thing he didn't discuss, that he needed to see the kid first without the others in his ear. He was on the roof when Mark landed. Mark landed on the far end of the roof, 30 feet away, and did not look surprised by Butcher's presence. He stood there for a moment in a way that could have been taken for a man orienting himself after a flight, but which Butcher's instincts, after a career of reading people, read as something else, the stillness of someone who had already decided to let the approach happen. Butcher started with directness, because directness was his version of charm, and also because he had the sense that other approaches were going to be efficiently dismantled anyway. He identified himself. He said he knew what Homelander was. He said he had evidence of what Vought had done, and that there was a way out if Mark wanted one. Mark looked at him. The pause was long enough that Butcher prepared to speak again. "You've been following me for 3 days," Mark said. "Not a question. An observation, delivered with the flat completeness of someone stating a fact they have already fully processed." "We've been," Butcher started. "You and your team. I've heard the van twice this week. I've tracked your cigarette smoke for 6 days, you specifically, different brand from the others. A beat. You were on this roof before I left the tower tonight. Which means you know my patrol route, which means you have a source inside Vought." Butcher kept his face still. He was good at this. "That's moderately impressive," Mark said, and the phrasing landed wrong, not insulting exactly, but evaluated, the specific register of someone assessing a piece of equipment's specifications. Moderately, Butcher pivoted. The recruitment angle was gone. The kid had walked through it in 30 seconds, so he moved to leverage. He laid out what he had: the Flight 37 timeline. The collision between Vought's public narrative and the actual flight recorder data his source had accessed before it was quietly refiled. The specifics he could verify and the gaps he couldn't, presented honestly, because presenting it dishonestly to someone who had just demonstrated they were tracking cigarette brands from 6 days out seemed like a poor return on investment. He framed it as a choice: cooperate, provide intelligence, and the Flight 37 material stayed in Butcher's files rather than a journalist's inbox. Mark reached across without any visible preparation. His arms simply arrived at Butcher's breast pocket, the motion registering as blur rather than sequence, and removed a cigarette from the pack inside it. He held the tip to his own index finger for 2 seconds, during which the tip began to glow with the specific orange of a lit cigarette. Then he took one drag. Then he compressed the cigarette flat between 2 fingers, folding it in half the way you'd fold a piece of paper. He held the compressed cigarette for a moment, looking at it. "I know what you're trying to do," he said. "You're looking for the thing I care about enough to negotiate from. You think I have one." "Everyone has one, mate," Butcher said. He kept his voice even. Mark considered this. The consideration appeared genuine. He was actually thinking about it, not performing thought. "Maybe, but it's not you. It's not whatever's on the drive you have in your jacket. And it's not the 319 people on Flight 37. The number. The specificity of it." Butcher had kept his face still through considerable practice, but the 319 landed in a way that his face could not fully prevent from registering. "If you go public with what you have," Mark continued, "the news cycle runs a week. Vought Legal dismantles the forensic chain. Homelander gives 3 press conferences and cries at the appropriate moments. Your source inside Vought gets identified. You accomplish nothing. I have nothing to lose, and you have everything to lose." He looked at Butcher directly. "I'm not Homelander. He cares what you think of him. I don't." The wind on the rooftop moved between them. Butcher had been in rooms with Homelander twice, under conditions where Homelander was not performing. He understood the specific quality of danger in those rooms, the volatility of it, the way it hung in the air like static before weather. This was not that. This was the absence of volatility, which should have been reassuring and was instead more frightening than the static, because volatility at least gave you something to read. Butcher's voice dropped. He dropped the negotiation. He said, "You're a kid. Whatever happened up there, whatever he made you do, you're still a kid. There's a way out that doesn't end with you being whatever he's making you into." Mark looked at him for a long moment. "He didn't make me do anything," he said. "I made a choice. I made it because the alternative compromised a mission my father gave me. The 319 people were not in my calculation." Butcher said nothing. "And I don't feel bad about that," Mark said. "I expected to. I was waiting for it. The guilt. It never arrived." He said this with the specific quality of someone reporting a physiological finding, something noted, catalogued, neither celebrated nor mourned. Just observed. "You should be more afraid of me than you are of Homelander. Homelander needs your fear. He needs your love, actually. Did you know that? He is desperate for it. He has a son he barely knows how to be in the same room with, and still that need shapes every decision he makes. Every decision he makes is downstream of it. I am not. Do you understand what that difference means for you?" Butcher understood. He was understanding it in real time. The full architecture of it assembling in his mind with the particular clarity of an answer you did not want to find. "Go home," Mark said. "Work on Homelander if you want. He's a simpler problem." He stepped off the roof. Butcher sat in the passenger seat of the van for a long time. In the back, asked what happened. Frenchie watched Butcher's profile. Kimiko looked at the building they'd parked near. her expression doing the thing it did when she was processing information through filters most people didn't have. Butcher lit a cigarette, his own pack, which had one fewer cigarette than it should have. He smoked half of it. "Is he reachable?" Frenchie asked. Butcher stared through the windshield. "No," he said. A pause. "Is he dangerous?" Butcher took a long drag. "Let it out slowly. He's not dangerous," he said. "Dangerous means I have a move. He's something else." He started the van. They drove in silence through the Lower East Side, past the specific nighttime texture of a city that did not know what was walking around in it. That night, in his apartment, Butcher took a drive out of a drawer that had been sitting there for 4 months. He looked at it for a while. He began, for the first time, to think seriously about what it would mean to release the Flight 37 footage. Not to stop Mark Grayson. He had spent 4 months believing that was a viable objective and 30 minutes on a rooftop learning it wasn't. To accelerate the only outcome he could still influence. To use the monster to kill the slightly smaller monster, on the cold-blooded theory that the world was marginally better served by one devil than 2. He was aware this was a deal with the devil. He made it anyway, because Billy Butcher had never had the option of clean hands, and had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around year 3 of this work. He put the drive back in the drawer. He was not ready yet. But the decision had been made in the way that decisions sometimes got made, not with a moment, but with the slow accumulation of evidence until the conclusion became inevitable. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, which was not unusual. 18 months passed. Invincible's Q score reached the top 3 soups globally without Vought marketing him aggressively, which was the detail that the brand analytics team found most significant and most difficult to explain to the board. The standard playbook for a new 7 member involved 18 months of controlled exposure, calibrated media appearances, co-billing with established members, a narrative arc that built toward a defined public identity. They had done none of this for Mark. What they had done was field him, repeatedly, and the cameras kept catching things that the narrative management team could slow, but not stop. Homelander's Q score had declined 4 points. The analytics team presented this with the same professional neutrality they applied to everything, which required more discipline in this particular case than in most. During the same 18 months, the Deep had been removed from active 7 duty following a conduct review that the institution had managed with its characteristic combination of speed and opacity. The specifics were handled in legal. He was gone for 7 months, then reinstated, and he came back quieter than he had left, which was the institutional signature of a process that had communicated something to him about the cost of the wrong kind of visibility. He returned to his seat at the briefing table and said less than he used to, and looked toward Homelander with the careful frequency of a man recalibrating where the safe spaces were. In the restricted medical file that 3 researchers had access to, the following had been noted: cellular density increase of 17%. Healing rate improvement beyond instrument calibration. Thermal tolerance exceeding measurable range. The language of these notes was careful and clinical, which was the language of people trying to describe something their instruments were not designed to describe. Mark Grayson was not the same person who had walked into Sublevel 7 with a scuffed backpack. He would not have described himself this way. He did not experience the change as change, he experienced it as clarification. The slow process of understanding, with increasing precision, what he actually was, and what the environment around him actually contained. The environment had not changed. His capacity to read it had. Annie January had watched this process from the inside, with the attention of someone who knew they were watching something they did not yet have adequate language for. She had come to Vought with a version of herself that she understood. A person with a moral center, which was the thing this building worked hardest and most systematically to remove. She had managed, so far, to keep the center. It cost her differently every month. She watched Mark and understood that the cost she was paying was real, because here was what happened when it stopped being paid. The Tuesday corridor exchange happened at 9:25 am, which was an ordinary time for an ordinary corridor on an ordinary Tuesday, which was the context that made it not ordinary at all. Mark was walking to a briefing. His posture had shifted since the beginning, not aggressively, not with performance. He simply moved through space with the quality of someone who had run out of reasons to make himself smaller and had stopped doing it by default. He occupied his actual dimensions. This sounds like a minor thing. In the context of Vought Tower, it was not. Homelander intercepted him at the junction between the east and west wings. The interception was timed. Mark clocked this within the first second, noted the position Homelander had taken up before he turned the corner, filed it. The opening was performed casual. Homelander mentioned yesterday's building site response, the structural failure on the West Side infrastructure project. 3 workers trapped under a collapsed section. The response that had put Mark on every evening news broadcast in the country. He mentioned it lightly, in the register of a senior colleague noting something that needed addressing. He said Mark's response time had made the split-screen comparison between his arrival and Homelander's look poor, that the cameras had captured the sequence gap, that this was something they should coordinate going forward. Mark stopped walking. He didn't turn his full body. He turned his head, which was less than a full turn, which was more dismissive than a confrontation would have been. "You were 12 seconds late to the building site," he said. The structural failure had already begun. "I moved when the math required it." "The public doesn't see math," Homelander said. "They see sequence. They see who arrived first." "I know. So next time, you wait." 5 people would have died in 12 seconds, Mark said. He turned back toward the direction he had been walking. "That's a acceptable number." "I know. You've said this. I've heard the calculus." He continued walking. Not faster. The same pace. "It made more sense to me 18 months ago." A beat. He did not stop. "It doesn't make sense now because it isn't actually about acceptable numbers," he said. "It's about your frame in the shot. Don't rephrase your ego as policy." He rounded the next corner. He did not look back. Homelander stood in the junction between the east and west wings for approximately 4 seconds. The FAC ran its cycle. A security camera on the ceiling captured the 4 seconds, and the footage existed in Vaught's system for 6 hours before someone in the PR infrastructure quietly removed it, which was itself a data point about how clearly the PR infrastructure had read what those 4 seconds contained. The team briefing 2 days later had a texture that the previous 18 months of briefings had not had. The deep looked toward Mark when Homelander gave the first operational directive. It was a small movement, a reflex rather than a choice. The body following the hierarchy its nervous system had quietly reorganized. He caught himself and corrected, but the correction was visible to anyone paying attention. A train was quieter than usual. The specific quiet of calculation. The quiet of a man deciding which way the wind was going before committing to a position. Black Noir had been doing something in the field over the past 6 weeks that no one had given him direction to do. In every joint response, he had been positioning himself in Mark's proximity rather than Homelander's. Not dramatically, there was no drama in Black Noir's operational decisions. But the pattern was there for anyone who ran the incident footage, which Mark had, because he ran everything. Black Noir's cognitive architecture was routing toward the most effective force in the room. It was the most honest evaluation in the building. Annie sat at the table and watched the room with both things simultaneously, the hope she was working to protect and the clear-eyed analysis of what she was watching. She had been inside Vought long enough to know what a power shift looked like in its early stages. She had been inside long enough to know that power shifts did not necessarily produce better outcomes, and that the specific quality of Mark's coldness was a different kind of problem from Homelander's volatility, not an improvement on it. She held both of these truths at the same time, which was exhausting, and she was getting very good at exhaustion. Queen Maeve sat at the far end of the table and watched Mark in a way that was different from the watching she had done 18 months ago. She had understood something before everyone else and had been watching the world catch up to her understanding. The new data was, the thing she had told herself might be an improvement over Homelander was not going to be an improvement for the human species. She had understood this for about 6 months. She was still here. She was always still here. Survival required a flexibility of principle that she had made her peace with in the years before Mark arrived, and would continue making her peace with in the years after. The quarterly metrics presentation happened in the executive conference room on the 91st floor. Caroline Park, VP of Talent Strategy, presented with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared this presentation 4 times and learned from the first presentation that the room required a specific quality of professional neutrality. She showed Invincible's numbers. She showed Homelander's numbers. She showed the gap. Homelander asked, very quietly, who had approved Mark's last 3 solo appearances without co-billing. Park opened her mouth. Edgar's voice came through the conference room speaker before she could speak. Edgar was not in the room. Edgar had not been in the room for this kind of meeting in several years, because his presence tended to communicate a level of concern that the public metrics did not require, and the private metrics he managed separately. "I did, John," Edgar said. The room went still in the way that rooms went still when the temperature dropped, not visibly, but felt. "The market data supports solo appearances at this stage of his profile development," Edgar continued. "We can discuss the methodology if you'd like." Homelander looked at the speaker mounted in the conference room ceiling. His jaw had a specific set to it that his face produced when the machinery behind it was running at full capacity, and the output was being very deliberately withheld. "No," he said. "That's fine. 2 words. Even, controlled. The specific control of a man applying pressure to something internal that wanted very badly to be external." Park returned to her presentation. She moved through 2 more slides before her voice settled back to its baseline register, which took longer than it usually took. The sub-level training facility 3 days later. Their sessions had continued, officially structured as mentorship, which was a description that had never been accurate and was now operationally absurd. Homelander arrived first, which was unusual. He was seated when Mark entered, which was the posture of someone who had decided in advance what this session was going to establish. He stood when Mark crossed the room. He covered the distance between them in 2 steps, and his hand closed on Mark's arm. Hard, the full grip of the strongest compound V expression in existence, applied without preamble. The move that had established hierarchy over every soup below his tier for 15 years. Mark's arm did not move. Homelander's grip had approximately 4 seconds of experience with resistance before it encountered something it had never encountered, which was resistance that simply was not interested in resolving in his favor. Mark's arm stayed where it was. The grip tightened. The arm stayed where it was. Homelander's hand was applying its full output against a surface that registered it the way stone registers pressure, as a fact, without consequence. Mark looked down at Homelander's hand on his arm. He looked up at Homelander. The expression on his face was the one the story had been building toward without announcing it. Not contempt, not defiance, not anger. Something quieter and more final. The expression of a doctor reviewing a set of symptoms they've seen before and already know how to classify. "You're going to hurt your hand," he said. He removed Homelander's grip. Not aggressively, the motion of removing something from a place it shouldn't be. He moved it the way you move a cup someone has left on the wrong surface, with the specific, incidental finality of a correction that requires no discussion. He walked to the training equipment. He began his session. Homelander did not follow him. He stood where Mark had left him, and his hand was at his side, and the expression on his face was something that the security footage captured, but that no one in the building had a clean word for. It looked, the narrator notes, a great deal like the beginning of something. The beginning of the thing that would end, several months later, on a balcony with cameras watching and a crowd below, and Homelander's heat vision firing into a chest that did not care about it. But first, it looked like this. A man standing in a training facility, looking at the space where his hand had been, and understanding, for the first time in 15 years, that there was a ceiling above him. The footage went through encrypted journalist channels at midnight. Butcher had spent 4 months building the legal buffer around it. The source chain, the evidence documentation, the specific pathway that put enough distance between himself and the origin point that Vaught's legal team would need weeks to dismantle it. And weeks was the entire product. He wasn't selling permanence. He was selling a news cycle. The footage was 47 seconds. He had curated it from the full cabin recording, the interior feed from Flight 37's own system, which had continued recording through the incident because aircraft systems were designed for exactly the scenario of the aircraft doing something catastrophic while the recording equipment survived. The feed showed 2 things with clean, unambiguous clarity: Homelander and Mark Grayson entering the aircraft through the fuselage breach, and Homelander and Mark Grayson departing the aircraft approximately 4 minutes later. The departure was the key. They left. The descent curve began immediately after. The mathematics of the timeline required no interpretation. By 3 a.m., 3 major news networks had it under the classification breaking developing, attributed to sources inside the aviation safety investigation community. By 6 a.m., 74 million views. By 9 a.m., the platforms had stopped updating the count in real time because the real-time figure was creating its own story. Edgar's crisis response convened at 5:30 a.m. He did not raise his voice. He did not display urgency in any register that his team could detect and use to calibrate their own responses. He presented options in order of viability. The narrative team ran frameworks simultaneously on 3 screens: counter-interpretation of the footage, equipment failure narrative, classified operational context that the public could not be given access to without compromising ongoing security operations. Legal was already building the chain challenge. Mark was in the room. Edgar had asked for him specifically, which the narrative team had processed without comment, which was itself a form of comment. Mark sat at the far end of the table and listened. He did not speak during the crisis response discussion. He watched Edgar move through the options with the attention of someone learning a system, not the content of the options, but the decision architecture behind them. The order Edgar presented things, the questions he asked, the way he flagged the options he had already discarded before presenting them, which he did through a very slight change in his vocal pacing that was probably invisible to everyone in the room except Mark. Homelander was not present. This was noted by everyone in the room, and not discussed by anyone in the room, which was the kind of institutional silence that communicated volumes. Homelander had watched the footage 9 times before the 6 briefing he did not attend. 9 times was not obsession. 9 times was the specific number of viewings required for his mind to fully process the thing the footage contained. Because what it contained was a problem his psychology was not well equipped to solve. The problem was not legal. Vaught's legal team would handle the legal problem. The problem was the footage's relationship to the story he had been telling about himself for 15 years. The story was, Homelander is what he is because of what Homelander is. His supremacy is not institutional. It is not granted. It is biological fact, demonstrated continuously, undeniable. He had built this story carefully and continuously, and it was the architecture on which everything else was constructed. The public performance, the relationships, the internal mythology that made it possible to do the things he had done and continue doing them. You could do a great deal if you believed deeply enough that your nature authorized it. He thought, briefly, of Ryan, his son, who was still learning what he was, who looked at Homelander sometimes with the specific open expression of someone whose model of a person has not yet been fully formed by evidence. That look was the one thing in Homelander's life that still produced something that felt, faintly, like warmth that wasn't performed. The footage did not erase that, but it made the warmth feel smaller against the cold of what it surrounded. The footage showed him leaving an aircraft with 319 people on it. It showed him making a choice. And choices implied alternatives, and alternatives implied the story was not about biology, but about decisions. And decisions could be evaluated morally, and moral evaluation was the one framework Homelander's entire construction was designed to prevent. He had watched it 9 times. He was not going to watch it a 10th. By 11 a.m., the crowd outside Vought Tower was several thousand people. The organization behind the rapid mobilization was Butcher's Ngo Contacts. He had called in 2 years of favors in 48 hours, which was the kind of resource expenditure that communicated the priority level he had assigned to this particular moment. The crowd had signs and structure, and the specific energy of people who had been waiting to be allowed to say something out loud, and had finally been given the permission. The sound of it reached the upper floors of the tower. Not the words. At 90-something stories, the words dissolved into a composite frequency that was human voices, combined into something beyond language. But the volume of it, the sustained directional quality of thousands of people producing sound toward a single target. This reached Homelander's floor. This reached Homelander. He went to the balcony at 2:15 p.m. He went alone. The assistants who tried to intervene found that intervention was not a category that applied to the situation, because the situation involved a man who could remove every obstacle between himself and the balcony door without effort, and who had stopped performing the social contract that made obstacle removal feel unnecessary. The balcony ran the full width of the tower's south face, a corporate architectural gesture, the kind of feature that appeared in photographs of the building without being used for anything. Homelander stood at the railing and looked down at the crowd. The crowd, catching the movement at the railing, began to orient toward it. Phones raised. Some people started shouting, directed now, a name, his name, but not the way his name was supposed to sound when people said it. The sound of several thousand people saying your name in anger was a different frequency from the sound of several thousand people saying it in love. Homelander's entire nervous system was calibrated for the second frequency. The first was input his system had no productive pathway for. His eyes began to glow. The specific red warmth of heat building behind them, not fired, building. The crowd closest to the front began to notice. Several people started moving backward. Several more took out phones. Some stopped moving entirely in the specific paralysis of a body that has registered a threat faster than the mind has processed it. He was actually doing this. Mark came through the glass doors. Inside, Annie had been watching the trajectory of Homelander's movement through the tower for the past 20 minutes, with the specific dread of someone who knows what they are watching and is doing the math on whether they can stop it. She had reached for her phone twice. She had started toward the balcony once before Mark's figure moved past her in the corridor. Fast, definite. The pace of someone who has already completed the calculation she was still running. She let him go. She understood, in the 3 seconds it took his figure to clear the door frame, that the intervention he was capable of and the one she was capable of were not the same category. Mark moved through the glass doors, past Homelander, and stood at the railing, between Homelander and the crowd. He did not face Homelander. He faced out, toward the crowd, toward the phones, toward the cameras that were already finding him and transmitting. The crowd's composite sound changed. The chanting broke into patches as the front rows registered the new figure at the railing. The patches spread outward. People were watching. "You're about to kill 4,000 to 6,000 people for making you feel bad about yourself," Mark said. Loud enough for Homelander's ears, which at this distance meant loud enough for the phones below. He said it the way you'd read a diagnosis, accurate, specific, without affect. Homelander said nothing. The red in his eyes held. "I'm trying to figure out if you understand how small that is," Mark said. "A beat." He turned, now facing Homelander. Back to the crowd. "Not the number," he said. "The reason. The two of them." The tower's south face. The crowd below and the cameras and the city extending out beyond the crowd in every direction, enormous and indifferent and continuing regardless. Homelander's heat vision fired. It was not a focused shot. It was the full output blast of a man who had lost tactical control. The wild release of something that had been building for 18 months and had finally found the moment its restraint mechanism failed. Point blank into Mark's chest. The specific high-pitched sustained frequency of the thing firing at maximum intensity, continuous. A sound that was uncomfortable to be near and was now going out on every phone feed below. 4 seconds. Sustained, the crowd below went completely silent, which was a thing that several thousand people accomplished simultaneously without coordinating it. The heat vision stopped. Mark's suit had a scorched oval across the sternum, the fabric destroyed. The edges of the destruction clean in the way that intense and focused heat left clean edges. The skin beneath it was unmarked, slightly warm, the way skin looked after an hour in direct sunlight. He looked down at the scorch. He looked up. The crowd below was still silent. Every phone was raised. Every feed was running. "That's everything you have, isn't it?" Mark said. "The flatness of it. The complete, genuine flatness of a statement that was not performing calm, but simply was calm, in the way that objects are calm, without the possibility of being otherwise." The crowd's silence held for 3 more seconds. Then it broke, and the sound that replaced it was something that did not have a clean word, and had never needed one before this moment, because this moment had never happened before. The crowd below was still producing the sound that had no clean word when Mark spoke again. He was still facing Homelander. Back to the railing, back to the cameras, the city extending behind him in every direction. Homelander's eyes had dimmed from the firing intensity, but not entirely. A residual warmth at the edges that was the visual record of something that had spent itself completely and found the expenditure had accomplished nothing. "You're about to tell me that the heat vision was a warning," Mark said. "That you were demonstrating something, not attempting something. I'd rather we not do that." Homelander said nothing. "The feeds are running," Mark continued. "Everything from the last 40 seconds is already in 14 countries. The narrative team is watching from inside and trying to decide whether this is salvageable, and the answer they're arriving at is no, but they'll try anyway, because it's their job." He glanced at the scorched oval on his chest, the clean-edged destruction that stopped at a line where the fabric ended, and his skin began. "This is useful, actually. I was going to have to find a different moment to say what I'm going to say." "You made it easier." "What you're going to say?" Homelander repeated. His voice had the specific texture of a man trying to locate the register he usually occupied and finding it temporarily unavailable. "Yes." Mark walked to the railing and stood beside it rather than in front of it, which changed the geometry. He was no longer between Homelander and the crowd. He was beside the railing with Homelander in front of him and the city visible to both of them. The shift was small and deliberate and communicated, to anyone reading it, that the buffer was gone. "You are a product," he said, not loudly. The phones below were sophisticated enough to catch it. "You were manufactured in a laboratory from components that weren't designed to do what they made you do. You are the ceiling of what Compound V can build. I understand why you thought that was impressive. It is impressive, the highest ceiling in human biology, by a significant margin." He looked at Homelander with the diagnostic expression that had been developing across months of careful observation. The expression that had first fully appeared in the training facility, when he removed Homelander's grip from his arm the way you'd move a cup from the wrong surface. "But I'm not human biology," he said. The crowd below had the quality of a collective held breath. Thousands of people doing the same thing simultaneously, producing a silence that was not the absence of sound, but a specific sound of its own. Homelander's jaw worked. The performance machinery was still running. Mark could track it. The way you could track the sound of an engine that was working harder than its design anticipated. The warmth was trying to reinstall itself and the mechanism was failing. "I made you," Homelander said. The voice that came out was not the public voice. It was something raw, with the specific texture of a person speaking from a place they had not planned to speak from. "I found you. I trained you. I taught you how this world actually works. You taught me that humans are disposable," Mark said. "Correct, efficient lesson. Then we're the same. No, one syllable. Flat, complete, not raised, not emphasized. Simply placed in the space between them with the weight of something that had always been true and was only now being said out loud. You need them to love you," Mark said. The them was not explanatory. It didn't need to be. Homelander's eyes moved briefly toward the crowd below, which was the involuntary motion of a man whose most fundamental psychological need had just been named in front of several thousand witnesses and the cameras they were holding. You need it the way a drowning person needs air. You have needed it every day of your life, and every decision you have ever made has been in service of that need. The deaths, the performances, the image management, the press conferences where your voice breaks at exactly the right moment. You are standing on this balcony because 4,000 people below stopped providing the thing you need, and the absence of it is breaking you in real time. He took a step toward Homelander, not aggressive. The step of someone covering a distance that had ceased to be relevant to keep. "I don't need anything from them," he said. "I don't need their love, their fear, their acknowledgement, their awareness that I exist. I don't need anything from you. I don't need anything at all." Another step. "Do you understand the difference between us? It's not the strength. The strength is a consequence. The difference is the need. You are the most powerful human specimen ever manufactured. Emphasis on manufactured. Emphasis on human. And you are standing here coming apart because a crowd stopped approving of you." He was directly in front of Homelander now. 18 inches. "Every chain that has ever held me," he said, "was made of things I still cared about. That's gone now. That is what Viltrumite means. You should have left me alone. I would have been useful to you." Homelander's face was doing something that the cameras below captured from multiple angles and that the analysts would spend weeks describing without landing on adequate language. It was not anger exactly. Anger had a direction, a target, a productive outlet. This was the expression of a man whose fundamental architecture was encountering a load it was not built to carry. The weight was not the words. The weight was the look in Mark's eyes while saying them. The look of a man for whom this conversation had a predetermined duration, and that duration was nearly elapsed. "I built this," Homelander said. His voice had shed another layer of performance. What was underneath was not vulnerability exactly. Homelander's construction did not have vulnerability in it. It had the specific rawness of exposure, which was different. This organization, this world, the entire system that made you possible, you were a component in a system, Mark said. Edgar built the organization. Vought built you. You performed your function. The system produced me as an unintended consequence. He looked at Homelander with something that might have been the closest thing to acknowledgement his current psychology could generate. Not warmth, not respect in any human sense, but the specific recognition one apex gives another before the hierarchy is resolved. You did your job. The job is finished. You can't. I already have, Mark said. Look at the crowd. Look at the feeds. Look at your own chest. Look at my chest. The demonstration is over. The only remaining question is whether you understand what was demonstrated. Homelander looked at Mark's chest, the scorched oval on the suit fabric, the unmarked skin beneath it, the specific, complete absence of consequence where consequence was supposed to be the entire point. His voice, when it came, had something in it that neither the public register nor the raw register had contained. Something closer to the sound a person makes when they have run the numbers on a situation they have been avoiding running the numbers on, and the numbers have come back wrong. Not a sob. The precursor to one, arrested, in a man who would not allow it. I was the most powerful thing, he said. Present tense becoming past tense mid-sentence, which was itself the most honest thing Homelander had said on this balcony. You were, Mark said. For a long time by the standards available. That's not nothing. He said this without cruelty, without satisfaction. It was the specific affect of someone stating an accurate historical fact about a period that had ended. What I am, Mark said, is not what you are. Not a better version, not an evolution. A different thing entirely. You were made. I was matured. He looked at the city extending beyond the crowd, the enormous, indifferent continuity of it. You should have left me alone. He said it a second time. Not for emphasis, because it was the accurate final assessment of the situation, and it was worth saying twice. Homelander stood on the balcony of the tower he had built his life inside of, and his eyes were not glowing anymore. The warmth was gone from them. What was there instead was the specific quality of vision in a person who has just seen something they cannot unsee and are processing what that means for every prior version of what they believed. Mark turned from Homelander and looked at the city. Tomorrow, he said, we'll discuss the organizational structure. Tonight, you should think about whether there is a version of the next conversation where you still have a functional role. He paused. There is one. I want to be clear about that. But you'll need to decide whether you can inhabit it. He went back inside. Through the glass, Annie was there, still there, having watched the whole thing from inside, her expression doing what it did when she had fully processed something and had not yet decided what to do with the processing. Mark walked past her without stopping. She watched him go. Homelander stood on the balcony alone. The cameras found him and stayed. The crowd's sound continued. His hands were at his sides, and the city was enormous around him, and the balcony had, in the last 4 minutes, become a different kind of space than it had been before. The kind that used to be the highest point in a territory, and had just stopped being that, without the territory changing at all. Homelander did not sleep. This was not unusual. He had never slept well. The specific insomnia of a man whose nervous system operated at a pitch that rest could not adequately address. But the quality of the wakefulness was different tonight. In prior sleepless nights, his mind had been productive, running scenarios, managing narratives, cataloging the specific emotional states of the people in his life, and calculating the optimal approaches to each of them. Tonight, his mind kept returning to a single image without resolution. The scorched oval on Mark's suit, the unmarked skin beneath it, the specific, complete absence of consequence. At 6 he stopped pretending he was going to sleep. He dressed. He looked at himself in the mirror for approximately 2 minutes, which was longer than he usually looked and produced nothing useful. He went to find Mark. Mark was in the training facility on Sublevel 4 when Homelander arrived. He had been there since 4 a.m., which the facility's access logs would later reflect. He was standing in the center of the space, still, looking at the wall, not meditating. Thinking, which for Mark had always been a physical act, had always required stillness rather than movement, the body going quiet so the mind could do what it needed to do. Homelander crossed the floor toward him. He did not speak first. He attacked first, which was the decision his psychology produced when the performance architecture had fully failed and the only remaining vocabulary was the original one. His punch came at Mark's face with full commitment. Not tactical, not testing. The complete motion of a man who has simplified a complicated situation down to its most fundamental component and is acting on it. The speed was real. The force behind it was everything Homelander had. 15 years of never pulling a punch against anything that could survive the full version. Mark caught it. The sound, a single sharp crack, the specific audio of an impact meeting resistance that does not yield, followed immediately by a second lower sound, the compression fracture register of bones meeting a surface they were not designed to meet at this velocity and force. Homelander's hand. The metacarpals first, then the cascade of the small bones of the fingers, then the specific wet failure of the forearm as the kinetic energy of the punch had nowhere to go, and the structure that had generated it became the structure that absorbed it. Homelander's sound was not a scream. It was the vocalization of a man whose entire identity had just been physically disproven, not a pain response, but a comprehension response. The noise a person makes when the most fundamental fact about themselves has been empirically refuted in a single second. It was brief. It stopped before it fully formed. Even now, even here, the part of him that monitored his own performance was monitoring. Mark held the fist. His grip was not squeezing, he was simply holding it, with the passive containment of a surface that did not need to actively resist, because resistance was not the relevant category. Homelander's other arm came up. The heat vision fired, the reflex of an animal returning to its only remaining tool, the specific desperation of full output aimed point blank at Mark's face. Mark turned his head 3 inches to one side. The beam past his cheek left a warmth on the skin of his jaw, approximately the warmth of direct sunlight on a summer afternoon. He turned back. He looked at Homelander. "For what it's worth," Mark said, "the fear you're feeling right now is an appropriate response to accurate information." Homelander was still making the attempt at a grip, his shattered hand trying to close on Mark's fingers. The biological insistence of a nervous system that had not yet fully transmitted the message that the grip was gone. The attempt produced nothing. His voice came out wet, which was new. Not tears, Homelander's voice coming from a place that was below performance and below the raw register that had been exposed on the balcony. A place that did not have a practiced quality because nothing had ever reached it before. "Wait," he said. Or something that resolved into wait. The word was not clean, was not the word he would have chosen if he had been choosing. It was the word that existed in the space below choice. Mark looked at him. The diagnostic expression held, the expression of a man reviewing a situation he had already assessed and whose conclusion had not changed. Homelander said something else. Several things, in rapid compressed sequence, that the feeds below, which were still running, which had been running continuously since the previous afternoon, because the networks had made the calculation that this was a story that had not concluded, could not cleanly capture. The words were wet and imprecise and contained fragments of several different things, an appeal to what they had built, a reference to the months of mentorship, possibly the word please, possibly just a sound that did not resolve into a word. Mark heard all of it. His expression did not change. He drove his right hand forward. The narrator does not elaborate. It states, with clinical precision, contact, penetration, cessation of vital function. 3 seconds total. The sound carried on the feeds was the sound of something brief, not dramatic, not extended, not scored for emotional impact. Brief, in the specific way that the most irreversible things are brief. The brevity was the element that no television audience could prepare for. Drama requires duration. What happened in 3 seconds on sublevel 4 of Vought Tower was not drama. It was a conclusion. Mark was on the balcony 11 seconds later. He had taken the elevator rather than flying, which the timeline would later show. The explanation was simple and was not offered to anyone. He had taken the elevator. because walking to the elevator and pressing the button and waiting for the car and riding it upward was an ordinary sequence of actions, and he was not going to perform urgency he did not feel or trauma he did not have. He stepped through the glass doors onto the south balcony. He was covered in blood that was not his. He stood at the railing. The crowd below had been sustained at several thousand people since the previous afternoon, which was now approaching 20 hours. A sustained public assembly of a scale that had not occurred outside of major sporting events in the city's recent history. The feeds were on him immediately. Every phone, every news helicopter running its pattern above the crowd, all of it oriented to the figure at the railing in the damaged suit. He looked at the cameras. He did not arrange his face. He did not perform grief or resolution, or the heroic necessity expression that Homelander had developed over 15 years into something technically perfect. He simply stood there, covered in blood, looking at the feeds with nothing performed in any direction. He stayed on the balcony for 11 seconds. The narrator counted them. Long enough for every angle to have a clean shot. Long enough for the image to achieve the quality of images that could not be managed after the fact, not because of their content alone, but because of their completeness. 17 angles, all of them clear, none of them ambiguous about what had happened or who had done it. Then he went back inside. Edgar was on 4 calls when Mark walked into the office 20 minutes later. He ended all 4 simultaneously, setting the phone down, pressing a single button, which communicated, in its efficiency, that whatever was on the other end of those calls was now secondary to whatever was about to happen in this room. He looked at Mark. He looked at the blood. He looked at Mark's face, which had the specific quality it had been developing across 2 years, the flatness that was not coldness but absence, the face of someone for whom the emotional temperature of a room was information rather than experience. Edgar set his phone face down on the desk. This was the most revealing gesture Stan Edgar made in the story. Face down meant he did not want to see the notifications. A man who had spent 40 years never missing a notification, who had built an empire partly on being the first to know everything, was turning his screen away from himself. "The board will need to be consulted before," he began. "I'm not consulting the board," Mark said. Edgar absorbed this. His face did not change. His face never changed, but something behind it was running very fast. "There are legal structures that govern, I know," Mark said. He crossed the room. He sat down in the chair Edgar kept for visitors, the one Homelander had occupied for years, returning to this room through every chapter of their particular arrangement, the seat from which every significant negotiation of the past decade had been performed. Mark sat in it with the ease of a man occupying a space that had been empty long enough to no longer belong to anyone. He put his hands on the armrests. He looked at Edgar across the desk, with the expression that made Edgar, for the first time in a career built on never being the subordinate party in any room, understand precisely what subordinate felt like from the inside. "Let's talk about what happens next," Mark said. Edgar opened with frameworks. This was what Edgar did when the territory was unfavorable. He built structure around the conversation, established procedural architecture, created the form of a negotiation even when the substance of one was not available. He presented the mutual benefit argument. First, Vaught's operational continuity, the value of existing infrastructure, the specific inefficiency of dismantling a system that served the goals of whoever controlled it better than any alternative. Mark sat and listened to all of it. His listening had a quality that Edgar registered and could not fully classify. It was not the listening of someone being persuaded. It was not the listening of someone preparing a counter. It was the listening of someone learning a system, which was a different category entirely, and which produced, in Edgar, the first genuine uncertainty he had experienced in a professional context in approximately 11 years. "Vaught's operational continuity," Mark said, when Edgar reached the end of the mutual benefit argument, "serves my interests better than the alternative." "Yes," Edgar paused. "I'm sorry?" "You're correct," Mark said. "I don't want to dismantle the organization. I want to redirect it. That requires you to remain functional, which puts your operational continuity in my interest. The argument is sound. Continue, A-Beat. Edgar continued. The legal structure argument, the independent contracting framework, the military asset agreements, the specific architecture of Vaught's relationship with federal oversight bodies that made unilateral restructuring legally complex. Restructure them, Mark said. My name on a holding entity I'll specify. Direct authority through that entity. Your legal team has 48 hours to produce the documentation. Edgar looked at him. His face maintained its composure with the specific discipline of a man applying considerable internal force to keep something external from moving. The board works for whoever controls the assets, Mark said. After today, that's me. You work for me. The board works for me. Vought works for me. He looked at Edgar with the flat diagnostic attention that had replaced his eyes as previous quality somewhere around month 14 at Vought. Is that clear? Edgar held the look for 3 seconds. Then, yes. 1 syllable. The most expensive syllable of Stan Edgar's professional life, produced with perfect control, costing him something that the perfect control was designed to make invisible. The Compound V research files, Mark continued, everything classified above clearance level 5, transferred to a server I'll designate by end of business today. The access keys come directly to me, not through an intermediary. Those files have national security classifications that transfer them. Edgar made a note. His handwriting was the same as it always was, uniform, small, legible. The steadiness of it was either genuine or the product of 40 years of practice, making it indistinguishable from genuine. The PR team stays functional, Mark said. Their mandate changes. They're no longer managing a performer's image. They're managing a power transition narrative. The transition is, Homelander represented a developmental phase of what Supes could be. That phase has concluded. What comes next is not a replacement, it's a correction. That's the frame. They have 24 hours to build the first release around it. They'll need direction on the Flight 37 material, Edgar said. The Butcher leak is still active in the news cycle, and the footage of today changes the context in ways that require leave the Flight 37 material alone, Mark said. It's useful. Edgar stopped. It establishes what Homelander was, Mark said. It establishes that the organization knew what Homelander was and fielded him anyway. That's uncomfortable for Vought in the short term, and it's useful in the long term because it creates the comparison. What came before and what comes now. He looked at Edgar. You understand the value of contrast. Edgar understood the value of contrast. Edgar had built his entire career on it. He made another note. The 7 assembled in the briefing room at 3 p.m. Mark did not call it a briefing. He called it a meeting, which was a word with different implications, and the 7 arrived having watched 11 hours of news coverage that had not reached a satisfying narrative resolution, and were operating in the specific psychological state of people whose organizational foundation had been removed, and who were waiting to learn what, if anything, was going to be placed underneath them. Mark stood at the head of the table. He told them 3 things. Homelander was dead. The evidence of how and why was on 17 camera feeds and had been viewed by a number of people that was currently being counted and was large. He did not editorialize on this. The 7 continued to operate, under their existing contracts, with Mark as effective director of operations. The contracts were valid, the payment structures remained. The operational mandates were changing in ways he would communicate in a separate session. Non-compliance was not a protected option. The Deep said, I just want to say, for the record, that I think this is a really exciting direction for the team, and I've always felt that the leadership structure needed someone with a clearer, a stronger. Stop talking, Mark said. The Deep stopped talking. A train put his phone on the table. This was a gesture. It meant he was committing attention, which meant he had something to say and had decided to say it. which meant he had run a calculation and arrived at the conclusion that saying it was worth the cost. "This isn't legal," he said. "We have contracts. We have a structure. There are people above this building who have authority over what happens in it, and you can't just." Mark moved. The motion was not dramatic. It was direct, covering the distance between his position at the head of the table and a train's position 4 chairs down in the time that it took a train's sentence to complete its final syllable. His hand contacted a train's rib cage at a precise point with calibrated pressure, not full force, not close to it, a specific application of exactly the force required to compromise 2 ribs without causing damage that would prevent a train from being functional in a week. A train's breath left him completely. He folded forward, both hands going to his side, the involuntary motor response of a body that has received significant structural information and is processing it. Mark returned to his position at the head of the table. The motion back was the same speed as the motion there, unhurried, the pace of someone who has completed a task and is returning to the primary task. "Sit down," he said to a train. "You'll heal. The contracts are valid. Anyone who has concerns about the legal structure should direct them to the legal team, which now reports to me, which means the concerns will receive appropriate attention." He looked at the rest of the table. "Does anyone else have procedural concerns?" The Deep did not speak. Black Noir was still. The remaining members processed the question and produced, unanimously, silence. Annie sat at the table and looked at Mark with the expression she had been developing since month 3 of his tenure, the expression of a woman who had understood something before most people and had been watching the world catch up to her understanding. She was not relieved. Relief would have required something to be better, and nothing was better. Homelander had been one kind of problem. What sat at the head of the table now was a different kind. She was still here. She would continue being here, making the calculations that survival required, looking for the angles that still existed for the people this institution was supposed to serve. She had not stopped looking. That was what she did. Queen Maeve sat at the far end of the table and watched Mark with the careful attention of a person revising their risk assessment with new data. The new data was, the thing she had told herself might be an improvement over Homelander was not going to be an improvement for the human species. She had understood this for about 6 months. She was still here. Survival required a flexibility of principle that she had made her peace with in the years before Mark arrived, and would continue making her peace with in the years after. Mark looked at Maeve last. He held the look for a moment, not a threat, an acknowledgement. The specific recognition of someone who had accurately read a room before the room was readable. "You're one of 2 people here who understood what I was before today," he said, and his eyes moved briefly to Annie before returning to Maeve. "Thank you both for not making this more difficult." Maeve said nothing. Her expression acknowledged the accuracy of the observation. She did not thank him. She was not grateful. She had no reason to be grateful for the replacement of one constraint with another. But she was, as she had always been, too pragmatic to waste resources on resistance that would not change the outcome. The Compound V labs occupied sublevels 9 through 14, and the lead researcher was in her office when Mark arrived at 5 p.m. She stood when he entered, which was the automatic response of someone whose nervous system had processed the events of the past 11 hours and produced a very specific instruction about how to conduct herself in any subsequent interaction with Mark Grayson. He told her the program's mandate was changing. Not ending, changing. The work was no longer about optimizing Compound V output or extending its biological ceiling. The biological ceiling of Compound V was a fixed point and they had reached it. The new work was about something else. He described the parameters. The researcher made notes. Her handwriting was less steady than usual, which was a fact, which the narrator reports as a fact without commentary. When he finished, she asked, What's the research objective? Mark looked at her, at the files behind her, at the banks of equipment through the lab's internal window, at the entire infrastructure of a program that had spent decades trying to understand and replicate and optimize a version of power that was, from Mark's perspective, a rough preliminary sketch of the actual thing. Understanding, he said. Complete understanding of what I am, what my biology is, how it works, what it's capable of. He looked at her. You spent 20 years studying a simulation. Now you have access to the source. The researcher looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her notes. Then she looked back at him with the expression of a scientist who has just been handed a research problem that would take 3 lifetimes and has started calculating how to begin. She said, she understood. She said the team could start immediately. Mark told her to start immediately. He left the lab. The building around him ran its systems, the FAC, the security infrastructure, the financial processing networks that moved billions of dollars through Vought's global operation every hour, the PR machinery that was currently generating the first release in the transition narrative, and all of it. Every system was running inside a structure that had one point of authority now, which was the same point of authority that had walked into this building roughly 2 years ago with a scuffed backpack and looked up at the cathedral ceiling and thought about how deliberately large it was. The ceiling had not changed. Everything beneath it had. 10 years passed. Earth did not become a dystopia in the cinematic sense. There were no bombed cityscapes. The streets did not look like the streets in the films Vought used to produce about what the world would look like without heroes. In most visible metrics, crime rates, regional conflict resolution, infrastructure stability in the developed world, and several parts of the developing world that had not previously qualified for that description, the planet was measurably better than it had been a decade ago. The mechanisms of this improvement were not democratic. They were not subject to oversight or appeal. Several long-standing regional conflicts had resolved in the specific way that conflicts resolve, when a force with no interest in negotiating and no vulnerability to conventional response makes its position known once and does not repeat it. The resolution was rapid. It was permanent. The humanitarian organizations that had spent decades working on these conflicts filed reports that described the outcomes as positive while carefully declining to describe the methods, which was the institutional equivalent of a person looking slightly to the left of something they have decided not to see. Vought International operated at 3 times its previous scale. Its board met quarterly and made decisions about resource allocation within parameters that had been established 10 years ago and had not been subject to revision because the person who established them had not found reason to revise them. The board understood this. They were well compensated for understanding it. Stan Edgar had retired at the end of year 3, not forced out. He had submitted a resignation letter that was 2 paragraphs and professionally neutral, and his successor managed the day-to-day operation with the specific competence of someone who understood that their role was execution rather than direction. Annie January had left Vought at the end of year 2. Not dramatically, there had been no public rupture, no feed-worthy confrontation. She had submitted the relevant documentation, negotiated a clean exit on terms that protected the people she had spent 2 years trying to protect within the institution, and walked out of the building on a Tuesday afternoon with nothing she hadn't brought in. She was still out there doing work that mattered in the specific ways that her particular combination of power, public profile, and moral conviction allowed. She was not comfortable. She was not safe. Exactly, she was herself, which was the most significant variable, and she had kept it. This was harder than it sounded. Billy Butcher was still out there as well, running operations that were local and specific, individual cases where abusers had been exposed. Individual soups whose conduct had reached a threshold that the existing oversight structure would not address, because the existing oversight structure reported to Mark, and Mark had not directed it toward those cases. Butcher addressed them. He had accomplished things over 10 years, real things. Things that had mattered to specific people in specific situations. He had not changed the structure. He understood this completely. He did it anyway, which was the most honest thing about him, and possibly the most honest thing in the story, and the narrator offers no further commentary on it. Mark Grayson was 29 years old. He had not appeared publicly in 8 months. Not because he was hiding. There was no mechanism by which he could be meaningfully threatened into hiding, and no person who would attempt to operate one, but because the systems ran. The world had oriented. Maintaining presence required continuous visibility, and continuous visibility was for entities that needed the world to be reminded of them. The world did not need reminding. The alert activated at 3:47 a.m. It had been dormant for 10 years, a specific frequency modulator that Mark had installed in Vought's monitoring infrastructure in year 2, keyed to a single energy signature that did not appear in any of their standard databases, because the standard databases had been built to track compound V biology, and this was not that. It was the travel wake of a Viltrumite moving through Earth's upper atmosphere on a controlled descent vector. Mark was notified on a system that did not route through any human intermediary. He received the notification. He was awake, which was not unusual. His sleep requirements had reduced to approximately 3 hours in the past 4 years, which the Vought research team had documented without being able to fully explain, which Mark had not asked them to explain because the explanation was self-evident to anyone who understood what Viltrumite maturation actually meant. He took 30 minutes. He reviewed the monitoring data, confirmed the trajectory, confirmed the approach velocity and the specific descent pattern, controlled. Practiced. The descent of a man who had made this particular approach thousands of times. Then he went to the roof. The city below him was lit in the specific way of 4 a.m., the ambient glow of a civilization that did not fully stop, the maintenance lights and the transit systems and the buildings whose occupants worked through the night for reasons that had nothing to do with Mark, and would continue after him and had continued before him. He stood on the tower roof and looked at it, and felt what he felt when he looked at it, which was the specific quality of arrival, the sense of being precisely in the place he was supposed to be, occupying precisely the position his biology had been building toward across 29 years of maturation. His city, his planet, his rules. Nolan descended through the cloud cover the way he always had, steady, controlled, the flight pattern of a man who had been doing this for 2,000 years and had developed the muscle memory of something geological. He landed on the tower roof 12 meters away and straightened and looked at Mark. The look lasted longer than it should have, given that they had not seen each other in 10 years. It lasted because Nolan was running an assessment, which was what Nolan did when he encountered a situation that required calibration before response. He was looking at his son. He was looking at the specific quality of stillness Mark occupied the roof with, the way he held his own weight, the complete absence of anything that read as uncertainty or expectation or need. Nolan smiled. The pride in it was genuine, one of the few genuinely unperformed things about him. He looked at what Mark had built, and the pride was real. "I heard about what happened here," he said. "What you built." He said it with the warmth of a man approving of a project that exceeded his projections. He said it with the implicit framing of someone who expected, naturally, that the next conversation was about next steps. The Empire's assessment. The integration schedule. The yield curves on a pre-softened planet. "The Empire isn't coming here," Mark said. The smile reconfigured. Not quickly. Nolan was too controlled for quick reactions. But it reconfigured, from pride into something more careful. The expression of a man whose model of the situation has just received a significant input. "Mark, this is my planet," Mark said. Nolan processed this in the specific way that Viltrumites processed significant information, not with visible reaction, but with a particular quality of stillness that was different from his baseline stillness. The stillness of active computation rather than controlled presentation. He had spent centuries managing planets and the beings on them, and the Empire's relationship to both. He had no category for a Viltrumite agent claiming an asset for themselves. The category did not exist in his experience. He was building it in real time. He tried several approaches. He tried them in rapid succession because he was intelligent and could see, partway through each one, that it was not going to produce the desired result, but the discipline of the attempt required completing the structure before abandoning it. The loyalty argument, everything Mark was descended from the Empire's genetic legacy. The obligation that created. The Empire's best product, Mark said, running their best outcome. And outgrowing their design. The family argument, the relationship, the investment, the fact that Nolan had spent decades building toward this. You left me with a man who needed to feel like the most powerful thing in any room, Mark said. You left me there because you calculated I was too strong to be permanently hurt. You didn't account for the other mechanism. Nolan was quiet. You were right, Mark continued. He couldn't hurt me. He taught me. There's a difference. He taught me what it looked like when power needed something from the world around it. He taught me by example what I was not going to become. And then my biology finished the job and produced something you didn't put in the calculation. He looked at his father. Not with anger. Anger required a specific relationship to the thing that had caused it, a residual attachment that expressed itself as heat. Mark's relationship to what Nolan had done was not characterized by attachment. It was characterized by the same diagnostic clarity he applied to everything. You wanted to give the Empire a prepared planet, he said. You gave me a laboratory. I learned more from it than you intended. Nolan looked at his son, really looked, the way he had looked when he landed and found something the assessment was not producing a clean category for. He was looking at 29 years of biological maturation that had not been supervised and had not needed to be. He was looking at the specific quality of self-sufficiency that Viltrumites were supposed to evolve toward, and that very few of them achieved completely. He was looking at someone who needed nothing from him. The professional recognition arrived before anything else. Nolan had spent centuries evaluating Viltrumite capability. The evaluation he was performing now produced a result that his pride tried to contest and his competence declined to. I didn't mean for this, he said. The performance had come down, not fully. Nolan's performance never came down fully, but enough that the words had weight below the surface of them. I know, Mark said. What I left you with was the correct environment, Mark said. Not intentionally, but correctly. A system designed to corrupt produced, instead, a clarification. I understand what I am now with a precision that a standard Viltrumite upbringing would not have provided. He looked at the city, at the specific 4M texture of it, the maintenance lights and the transit glow, and the ordinary continuation of millions of lives proceeding inside a structure they only partially understood. The terms, he said. The Empire will send scouts before any formal approach. When they arrive, they will find the planet defended. Not by Vaught's weapons, by me. He looked back at Nolan. If the Empire wants to discuss integration, they send an ambassador, not a general, not a fleet, an ambassador. They negotiate with me as a peer. The Empire will not negotiate with the Empire will calculate, Mark said. They always calculate. Run the numbers. A planet defended by a mature Viltrumite operating with full institutional infrastructure and 10 years of preparation. What does a forced conquest cost? What resources does it consume? Compare that to a productive protectorate managed by someone who understands both the human systems and the Empire's requirements. He held Nolan's gaze. I am the best possible outcome for this planet they have ever produced. I am their best deal. They are intelligent enough to understand this. Tell them, Nolan was quiet for a long moment. The city moved below them in its 4M rhythms. "And if they don't send an ambassador," he said. "If they send the fleet." Mark looked at the sky, at the specific darkness of it, the depth of it, the distance between where he was standing and the edge of what he had been building toward for 10 years in the Vought labs on sublevels 9 through 14. The research that the lead researcher had described, in her most recent report, as the most significant advance in biological understanding since the discovery of DNA, which was the kind of language scientists used when they did not have adequate language. "Then they find out what I've been doing with Vaught's labs for 10 years, he said. He did not elaborate. The elaboration was not necessary. Nolan was old enough and experienced enough to run the implications from the statement alone, and the implications were sufficient. Nolan left without a fight. He cleared the atmosphere in the specific way he had always cleared it. Steady, controlled, the departure of a man who had made a calculation and was acting on it rather than on anything else. He did not look back at the planet. He had not looked back the first time he left, 10 years ago, because looking back was a gesture, and Nolan did not make gestures. This time, the not looking back meant something different. This time, it meant he had seen what was here and was carrying it with him, and carrying it was the entire task now. He would return to the Empire. He would report. He would tell them what he found, and what he found would restructure their strategic relationship to this star system for decades. A Viltrumite who had claimed a planet for himself rather than for the Empire. A Viltrumite who had built defensive infrastructure that required assessment before any response. A Viltrumite whose biological maturation had proceeded, unsupervised, to a point that the standard evaluation metrics were not designed to measure. The Empire would calculate. They would take the time the calculation required. They would eventually send an ambassador. Mark watched his father's trajectory until it was a point of light, and then until it was not distinguishable from the stars. The sun was coming up on the east coast. Mark stood on the roof of the tower and watched it. The specific quality of dawn over a city that size, the light finding the upper edges of buildings before it reached the streets, the way the water towers and antenna arrays caught the first horizontal light and held it briefly before the angle changed, and the light continued its ordinary work of illuminating everything equally. He did not feel what a hero would have felt standing here. He did not feel the satisfaction of a protected population, the warmth of service, the specific meaning that came from placing yourself between people and the things that threatened them. He had felt versions of those things once, in the first months, before the layers had come off one by one in a midtown stairwell and on a Pacific-facing aircraft, and on a roof in the Lower East Side, and on a sublevel 4 training floor where something had reached completion. He felt arrival, clean and permanent and without ambivalence. His city, his planet, his rules. Nolan Grayson traveled 4 light years to give his son to monsters, on the theory that the monsters could not hurt him. He was right. He was also missing the point entirely. Mark Grayson did not need protection from the monsters. He needed time with them. Time enough to learn what he was. Time enough to stop apologizing for it. What Nolan built, on the other side of the galaxy and across a decade of careful strategy, was a planet ready for Viltrumite integration. What he actually built, what he came home to, was something the Viltrumite Empire has never encountered in its 1,000-year history. A Viltrumite who chose himself over the Empire, and built something worth choosing. History will call it many things. Mark Grayson calls it Tuesday. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.